let me ask you a question, because I know people are asking this question. 11th through 15th century.
Yeah.
How is this relevant? Because we have manuscripts that are over 1,000 years older than this.
Right, that's a really good question, John. And here's my answer to that. We already saw the church fathers from the 2nd century, 3rd century, even in the 4th century, who had a version of John that matched what we found in these manuscripts. And so that tells you, even though the only surviving manuscript that we currently know of is from the 11th century, this reading already existed in the 2nd century, and this has been acknowledged for hundreds of years in the church. Right? We had Vossius in 1643, we had Pierce in 1777, Henry Brown in 1844, and many, many others. We just brought a few of them. So this has been acknowledged for hundreds of years that the church fathers, when they read John 6:4, they didn't see that verse, or certainly didn't see the word Passover in it. And so, look, in archaeology, I did my undergrad in archaeology and biblical studies at a double major at Hebrew University. And one of the things we learned is what you find in archaeology is to some extent random. You don't, you go and you dig in a site, and you're not digging the entire site. You're digging a 5 by 5 meter section of that site. And if you have a really big excavation, you do 5 or 10 of those squares. But there's a whole part of the site you're not digging. And so what you find is somewhat haphazard. And we can actually see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a lot of copies of the book of Isaiah, a lot of copies of Deuteronomy that tells you those books were important to them. We don't have a single copy of the book of Esther. Why is that? It's just random what you find, right? Now, if you find a lot of something, maybe that was important to them. Okay, but why didn't we find one copy of Esther? Well, the copy of Nehemiah we found is like maybe this big, right? It's like a few verses, right? It's very small. And so there's an old Hebrew saying, "Lo matzinu eno ra'aya." The fact that you haven't found something is not a proof, right? So all we have is the evidence of what we did find. And what we did find is there's evidence in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, and others, we didn't bring everything, that they were reading John without 6:4, and then we find the manuscripts 11th to 15th century, and then 16th century and on, we find scholars telling us this explicitly, right? So we have a pretty much, other than this one period around the 5th to 10th century, you're right, we don't have a lot of evidence from there, but we do have before and we have after. Now, I want to bring an analogy here to something from the Tanakh. And here's a key point. The age of a manuscript does not necessarily tell you its importance. In other words, just because something is old doesn't mean it's correct. And we saw before Acts 21:25 in Codex Bezae. What if we didn't have Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus? We would look at Bezae and we might say, this is the oldest version. Maybe Acts 21:25 in the oldest version is telling us not to keep the Torah. Thankfully, we do have the other ones, right? But what if we didn't have it? Now look, we have this manuscript in the Tanakh, and this I call a twofer because it's also the name. This is a manuscript that has the full vowels Yehovah. It's in Lamentations 3:55. It's Cambridge Oriental 1753, and it's a very late manuscript. It's from the 16th century. However, in Tanakh studies, this is considered to be a direct copy of the Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex was completed around the year 930, and most of the section on the writings, the Ketuvim, is missing. And so when scholars want to know what the Aleppo Codex has in the Ketuvim, they look at Cambridge Oriental 1753. Even though it's from the 16th century, it's considered a direct or possibly second-generation copy of the Aleppo Codex, and hence has as much reliability, or is considered to have as much reliability as the Aleppo Codex itself. And here we can see in Lamentations 3:55, it says, Karati Shimcha Yehovah, I called upon your name, Yehovah, Yehovah with the full vowels. Beautiful. Can I get an amen out there?
Amen. Amen.
And the important thing here is just because a manuscript is late doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have value. It could have been copied from a much earlier manuscript that we don't have. In the case of Cambridge Oriental 1753, we do have it. We just don't have that section for the whole thing. I want to bring you a New Testament manuscript that John shared with me. Amazing example. I love this. John, tell the people what we have here.
Well, you guys may have heard the story back in 2005 when this particular papyri was dated. This is the earliest fragment from Revelation. This is the earliest fragment. And it's the passage talking about the number of the beast, except
Wait, I got to stop you. There's whole books and libraries you're going to destroy right now. Please. We need our end times. Don't do this to us.
this particular passage has the number of beast as 616.
And you can see it right there in the Greek. It's chi iota sigma, 600, 10, and 6.
If this is correct, in American history, the largest bonfire in the history of our nation will be Christian literature commenting on the book of Revelation, and the chronological gospels may wind up in the fire. So, because this is the earliest, if you take the position that the earliest manuscript is always the most accurate, this has consequences. Sometimes the earliest manuscript is not the most accurate. And the earliest manuscripts are the manuscripts that we don't have. Irenaeus, which is one of the church fathers that we had discussed. And I'll read the slide to you.
Yeah.
Irenaeus comments on this. He says, the number being found in the most approved and most ancient copies. And those men who saw John face to face, keep in mind, Irenaeus is the disciple of Polycarp, who's the disciple of John. So he knows people who knew John. And he says the most approved and most ancient copies, those men who saw John face to face, bearing their testimony, amount to 666. I do not know how it is that some have erred and have spoiled the middle number in the name, deducting the amount of 50 from it, so that instead of 6 decades, they will have, and my slide is...
They will have it there at that there is but one. In other words, in the time of Irenaeus, 100 years, about 100 years before that Papyrus 115, which was discovered in Egypt, you have Irenaeus saying, yeah, we know about the 616, but the most reliable copies of John, which we don't have anymore, they have 666. And he says not only is that in the most reliable copies, it's also the people who knew John himself. We asked them and they told us 616 is an error, it's 666. So here's the significant thing here, right? We have the oldest surviving manuscript of Revelation telling us 616. But Irenaeus tells us no, the ancient copies, which don't exist anymore, and those men who saw John with their own eyes, they tell us it's 666. So this is really important. Just because you have an ancient manuscript doesn't mean that that always preserves the perfect version. You've got to compare all of the evidence. And Irenaeus' explicit statement tells us that 666 is the correct number, not 616. And so what we end up having with the number of the beast is we have to rely on the church fathers, just like with John 6:4. Right? We have late manuscripts that support what that John 6:4 is added, but what we don't have is the early manuscript, but we do have the church fathers, just like in the case of this verse from Revelation and the number of the beast. Now, before we get to our next topic, I want to ask this question that some people might be in the audience, and I want to address it. I want to take it head on. Some people might be hearing this and saying, wait a minute, 616 and 666 and John 6:4, it's there, it's marked as doubtful and adulterous and all this. What is going on here? Should we just throw out our Bible? And my answer is the exact opposite. That this work has been done for centuries, and it's an ongoing project of people who are sifting through and discerning and trying to determine what is the original wording. And we're looking at ancient sources, church fathers, and manuscripts, and people are collating and going through and looking and comparing. And this New Testament that you have in the Greek, and not just in the Greek, also in other languages, meaning they also look at the Syriac and the Latin and in the Hebrew now and other sources. What we're witnessing is a process of sifting and going through and establishing this as maybe one of the most reliable texts in the history of mankind.